with the discussion that we have about the three papers, or three interventions especially. And I want to make, again, a point about the questions that we studied today, that is the question of refugees and migration. And this is that we need to give a hierarchy of problems and solutions and principles. It's impossible to put all in the same way. That is to say, we have in our tradition that we call the natural law, but we can say, to avoid the discussions about the value of natural law today, and this, we can say we have some exigencies or principles that are in the human nature, that are previous at the juridical questions. And for example, if someone needs to eat, we need to give it, because in our reflection, the goods of the planet are for all people to live in the planet. If one needs to have some other things fundamental, I think home or family, we need to help. This is one thing. And if we can we can give also work, because it's normally, as says St. Paul, that the people, if not work, not eat. But if we can. And after is the question of citizens, that is the participation in the choice of the common good of the country, of the national. And this is a more complicated question. And this, but in our discussion, in general, we discuss only about this last question. And this is the last question. We have other questions that are more fundamental that I think that we need to put here in the discussion. The other part is this is value for all people in the world, all persons. But for the people to be colonized in the last 2 centuries, there are special rights. If one African comes to Italy and say, look, I need something, we can say yes. And we have a special right to have this, because we use many things that you have in your country. Look, the Niger, and this is in relation with another very big problem that we study in the academy, and is one of the points that we want to study before. And this is the problem of the new form of slaves. As you know, the new form of slaves today grow in the world. We have 60 million of people to suffer this form of slaves. And naturally, the refugees, the migrations, is one of the forms of the trafficking to esclavize people. So I think it's impossible to not see these questions. For example, we have a meeting in Niger with Caritas, here as one of the responsible Caritas, and we visit the capital, and we visit also the favelas. And really, we can say that I was scandalized because not have hospitals, not have schools, not have anything, when Nigeria is one of the more rich countries in the world, in Africa, but also in the world. And also, there are some kind of leave in this, because the meeting was made in the center of one of these favelas. And we visit one parish, and there are some things that really the people to live and not respect these fundamental things, like the question of, there are aspects that I can say that not some think about consanguinity or other things that are very important that are not respected. And also, of course, there are very good auto route that is made for the Chinese today, but I think that it not work in this, the Africans, but also the China. So we need to have a consideration also historical about the different people to come one part, another part. And anyway, we can open new humanitarian corridors, like do here the governor of San Luis in Argentina, and this we need to be supported also for the European countries, and don't say nothing about it. Thank you.
On the topic of the migrants and refugees coming back, there were a couple of people who wanted to speak this morning that didn't before the break, so I can just call on, I think, Federico and Frank, if you both want to say a few things.
Many thanks. Is in relation with what we can say the roots of what we are dealing today, and the roots has been very well already referred, is war, and particularly an invasion that was done without the authorization of the Security Council. We must take this into account because it has been talking about the United Nations, about the role that is essential that has this institution, was a multilateral organization, a multilateral system, but you know that in the 80s, at the proposal of Mr. Reagan and Madam Thatcher, this was completely put aside, and then now we have what we have. We have the G6 at the beginning, after the G7, after the G8, now the G20. By the way, what a shame that the last meeting of the G7 that took place precisely here in Roma was agreed to increase the military budget, and what is even more shameful, the agenda, the points of the agenda on climate change and on sustainable development goals were put aside. I think that this is absolutely intolerable, because what we need is precisely, and it has been said today by Jeffrey, what we need is to realize that only a multilateral system could today deal with the problems of war, of the problems of climate change, and of the problems related with economy and with the social aspects of economy. By the way, I was talking precisely with Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, telling him that the real problem that we had in the United Nations has been ECOSOC, because ECO has been always been very, very active, and SOC nothing at all. And I remember that when I addressed some years ago, when I was Director General of UNESCO, the ECOSOC, I said, ladies and gentlemen, members of the ECOSOC, because, you know, after 50 years of the United Nations system, was never a meeting on social development. This took place in 1995 in Copenhagen, and was at the suggestion of UNESCO at this moment that we said we must have a meeting. We had so many meetings on economy. Well, this is to tell you that one of the suggestions that I think that today could be made in order to solve the problems that we have was to have a Security Council and to follow the Security Council's directives. Mr. Bush Jr. with Mr. Blair and with Mr. did not follow. And the invasion of Iraq, with more than 5 million displaced people, with a lot of people that was killed, these are at the roots of the problem that we have today. Because when you say all these people, the terrorism, etc., all these people, we did not, when we were in this very crucial moment, we should react. All the world should react telling no. An invasion without the agreement of the Security Council is not feasible. And we could have, perhaps, as a Security Council on social economic matters, not economic social, but socio-economic issues. I think that this will be very important as well, and another on environmental issues. Only one word concerning the environmental issues, the climate change. I am a scientist. I have been working all my life precisely on potentially irreversible issues. Because in the 60s, at the end of the 60s, I introduced already analysis in the children, in the newborn, that can avoid, if you have timely treatments, you can avoid neuronal diseases that are forever, are permanent disease. Then you have a child that is disabled during all his or her life when you could avoid this. Therefore, and this is one thing that I like very much of Sanchez Sorondo, when he says that we have a lot of diagnosis. We are listening a lot of diagnosis, but what we need today are timely treatments, not only treatments, but timely treatments, because we must avoid deterioration in the habitability of the earth. Our legacy to the next generations could be a disaster. And I must warn about this, because as a scientist, I know what is today happening. You know that with the Arctic, the melting of the Arctic, what we were saying, this is the consequence of the melting. Now it becomes the reason for another increase of 0.6 degrees every 10 years, because the albedo, that is the refraction of the solar radiations, are avoided. Well, what I wanted to tell you is that at this moment, for example, we are talking about Europe. And you know what Europe today is. Today is a monetary union, exclusively. And all are dealing exclusively on money. Some years ago, the Nordic countries, that has already been said, were very generous. It was a solidarity, a very important solidarity for the support for development. Today, nothing. In my own country, and here you have the minister that was there, in my own country, in the 2008-2010, we were having 0.6 of our GNP for support to development. Today, less than 0.1. And this is generally in Europe. Then what we're telling here, we have the development, sustainable development goals, what we're telling. Even the countries, the Nordic countries that were so generous today, there is no money for sustainable development. This must be very clear. We are talking here about development, and what we are doing, and this has been this morning said on some very important materials of Africa. Africa is a very rich continent, very rich continent. Today, Africa has coltan. The coltan is columbita tantalite material that is needed for the computers, etc. What we are doing, instead of cooperation, what we are doing is exploitation. And therefore, I remember when so many years in the United Nations we were talking about development must be integral, not only must be economic, must be social. Development must be endogenous, must be also, and development must be sustainable. And at the end of the 80s, Richard Jolley, that was at this moment the deputy administrator of the UNICEF, said development must be human. And then we have human, sustainable, endogenous, and integral. What we have today, the Pope has said this very clearly. He said we are in a globalization of insolidarity, globalization of lack of consciousness. We are not following what we must do. We know the problems, but we do not apply timely treatments. I consider that this what we need today very clearly, and we are urged because we are leading to potentially irreversible processes. Therefore, what I consider is that perhaps tomorrow we could provide some very concrete proposals. Very concrete proposals, for example, concerning the multilateral, because otherwise it's impossible to imagine that we can have the treatment of ODGs if now we know that Saudi Arabia, you can imagine, Saudi Arabia in charge of the war of Yemen. But what it is this? Who has decided that it's up to Saudi Arabia to deal with the war in Yemen? What is happening? What is happening is that we have put aside in the 80s the United Nations system. And now we have the G6, the G7, the G20, all these. One of the first things that must be suggested today is to end with this. We cannot have the G7 and the G6. We must have, again, a multilateral system. And, well, I have some other comments, but I would not like to be longer, and I will act afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank?
Thank you. I'm Frank Giustra. I'm the founder of the Radcliffe Foundation, and I want to talk about the refugee crisis specifically. And I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction than it usually is talked about. We, my foundation, which started 20 years ago, has taken the approach of private sector partnerships in trying to deal with a number of social issues, both domestically in my hometown of Vancouver and abroad, with poverty alleviation campaigns that I've been in partnership with President Bill Clinton on for about 12 years. And we are finding that when we employ private sector partnerships to solve social issues, we can do them much quicker, much more efficiently, and much more cost effective. I got involved in the refugee crisis 2 years ago, and I've immersed myself in it where it now takes up almost 100% of my time. And what we've tried to do is to employ an entrepreneurial style of philanthropy to solve problems that cannot be solved by the traditional international aid organizations simply because the problem is too big. They're overwhelmed, they're stretched thin, and they're hampered by a lot of bureaucracy and therefore can't act as quickly as we can act. I first went to Lesbos in 2015. I was brought there by a friend of mine who implored me to come and have a look for myself, and I'm glad I did, because had I not gone, I would have never understood the gravity of the situation. Since then, I have traveled extensively throughout the region, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, throughout Greece, and I've gone many times on many trips. And what I found is that each time we see a problem, a specific problem, and I could go through a whole series of examples of things that we've recognized, we've analyzed, and then we've implemented a solution, created a model, all with private sector money, and we've done it very quickly and very cost effectively. Everything from shelter to reception centers to search and rescue to basic delivery of humanitarian aid to education, job creation, vocation. We've done it all, and I could, if anyone is interested, when I have more time during the breaks, I'll be happy to fill you in. But what we found is that it works, and we create models that then can be replicated and scaled by others. And we've actually gone out of our way to get a lot of press on when we create a model such as the shelter we built with the IRC on the island of Lesbos, or the Alpida home, which was a renovated factory to house 200 Syrian families who were really desperate for proper shelter. And now we're about to do something even bigger because we're now bringing in more important partners, corporate partners, large corporations where we can leverage not only their money but their expertise to solve some of Greece's biggest problems with refugees, with respect to not just shelter for unaccompanied minors, but for vocation and training and job creation, and integrating these people into the community. Jeffrey, you mentioned something really interesting earlier, which has been one of my pet peeves, is the 2,040 billionaires that now exist with whatever, $7.7 trillion. What I have found throughout the years of dealing with these billionaire types is what we need to understand is that most people are inherently good, but they all live in a bubble. And one of the easiest ways to bring these people out of the bubble is to show them the problem. If you can bring them to the problem, as I have with many people over the years, whether it be in poverty alleviation, now with the refugees, you can bring them across the line very quickly. They're very willing to open their wallets once they have actually experienced the human suffering. They've seen it up close and personal. It's not a difficult thing to do. You just have to get their attention. So what I'm suggesting here today, and again, I'm happy to speak in much more detail when we have time later, but the faith-based communities around the world are in a great position to promote innovative ideas to resolve this crisis. This is a crisis that's going to be with us for a very long time, and again, the traditional aid organizations are just not equipped to deal with it for a number of reasons. And I think the private sector has a lot of capacity, a lot of resources, and a creative and innovative approach to solving problems. It's like an entrepreneurial approach to fixing a problem. Much as you would do in business, you can equally do it as equally well in solving a social problem. I've been doing this for many years. I know it works. And I think that's something that we should really look at on a global scale. We're going to continue to do our work. In the next few weeks, we'll be announcing a very major program in Greece, which involves a number of Fortune 500 companies and a number of local civic organizations in Greece, including my Radcliffe Foundation. And I think that that can be the start of something much more important that we can take to other regions of the world. Thank you.
I think we're moving close to lunchtime. Klaus, you just wanted a quick response, and then Jeff, and then Lisa.
Frank, I wanted, I'm looking forward to discuss things with you. I have been in charge of corporate philanthropy of a major pharmaceutical company for 35 years. And one of the lessons learned is let's very clearly differentiate what we mean if we talk about corporate philanthropy. If it is aid, as Jeff just said, focusing with, proceeding with a needs-oriented approach, focusing on the poorest of the poor, it's very good to use a private sector mind in the sense of it's an investment. Let's look that the biggest bang for the buck is given and cost effectiveness and efficacy is done. If it is smart marketing, which in many cases it is, the shared value approach of Harvard is one, it is a preparation of future markets, which is totally legitimate, except it leaves out those who need support most, because that's not going to be a market in the years to come. So also here, a differentiation and how shall I say, semantical clarity is very important. Otherwise, you mix up things by using terms that are not clearly defined.
Okay. Quickly, let's get Liza, who's been waiting, and then we close out with both Jeff and Bishop Sanchez, if that's okay, and President Prodi. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much. My name is Liza Barry. I am here representing UNICEF. While it has been mentioned, I think we can't emphasize enough that the refugee and migrant crisis is a children's crisis. Of the 23 million individuals, the 23 million people who fit the definition of refugee, more than half are children, more than half are girls and boys under the age of 18. The global number of refugee and migrant children who are moving alone has reached a record high. 35,000 children arrived in Italy last year. I'm sorry, last year and the year before. 1,000 didn't make it when they were traveling on their route. At least, so the number of unaccompanied and separated children who were moving last year was 300,000, up from just 66,000 in 2010. So, and of these hundreds of thousands who are moving on their own, I think I'm sure, as we all know, when they don't find opportunities to move legally, they resort to dangerous routes and they engage smugglers to help them cross borders. I think, as has been mentioned, there are serious gaps in laws and policies and services meant to protect children on the move, but they leave refugees and migrant children with no protection often. So I think, as we consider the issues over the rest of this workshop and the final statement that comes out, very important for us to make sure we have a focus on girls and boys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. President Prodi.
Only one word, I was fascinated by Jeff's idea when he remembered how UN now are better organized, and then the Global Fund on Education, it's, I think that we have to do what we can in this direction. But I tell you, my incredible experience, I have taken part to 10 G8, and we never delivered what we told. Never. And so I think that a very important task is to create a moral, ethical group that, every year says, look, this was the engagement and this was the deliver. Nothing else, nothing else. Because, no, really, I was incredible. You go to the G8 and you say, look, this is the place of the truth, And then we started for 1%, 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, and then, so simply somebody that remembers engagement. I think that this will be very, very important for the future of this type of engagement.
Jeff?
I recall in 2005 when the G8 met in the UK and promised to double the aid to Africa. And I was in the UK Treasury the next day, and I said, could we look at the spreadsheet of how this is going to be done? And they said, oh, no spreadsheet. Absolutely, that was an insistence, no spreadsheet. So
these are always like that.
yeah, no responsibility, no accountability, and by the way, no results on that. So it is really, it is our problem. We're not trying to shift a lot of resources. Everything we're talking about is small relative to global incomes and wealth. We're not in any of these cases talking about heroics. As a macroeconomist, I always emphasize the denominator, which is the output of the world, is $127 trillion a year. If you want to round to just 100 trillion, that helps. So 1% of 100 trillion is a trillion, and 100 billion is just 0.1 of 1%, and 10 billion, if you're interested in that, is 1% of 1%, 0.01%. It's not even a drama. $10 billion a year would change the face of global education. 10 billion incremental per year would end the AIDS epidemic. It's not even a heavy lift. And yet we're in a world where we're hearing about more tax cuts, where we are hearing about budget cuts for development aid, and so on. One answer which Frank gave us, and I think it's very important and very powerful, is don't whine, let's get on with practical cases. And Frank is an example of that, but we need you to help us find the others, bring them to see the reality, and get this done. Because I'm sure you're right, that there's a lot of, the resources are so vast right now. The word you used is my favorite word, attention. And it's when Pope Francis talked about indifference. He didn't say the globalization of evil, he said the globalization of indifference, that we're numb to it, we're not even aware of the reality. So I think we need to be very practical on all of these different fronts. The UN, we need it, frankly. We need the multilateral system, but it's very weak right now. And going back to putting a locus of responsibility and being clear about its weakness is extremely important. Not nice talk, but clear talk. The private wealth, absolutely. This is how the world has evolved. We need it desperately right now. And we need public sector responsibility, governments that are accountable. That's an age-old problem, but it's our fight too. So not one of these is sufficient, and we shouldn't put all the emphasis on one answer, but I think we've heard the range of approaches that we should talk about when we get to the specific problem solving.
Bishop Sanchez?
I want to say that we have today, maybe not in the past, and to have some hope of the experience of the people to have experience. That today there are we can say a common goal between the spirit of the magisterium of the popes, and especially Pope Francis, and the spirit of the United Nations. We can believe that this is the same spirit. And this is just to approve the Laudato Si is very near to the SDG goals. And especially I want to say, for the question of religion, the first meeting that we organized here was with the Pope and with the more important leaders, religious leaders. For the Muslim camp, the two traditions, Al-Azhar and also Iran, and Ayatollah, and also we have the chief of the Anglicans, Welby, the two traditions, also the Jews, and all agree about this. Maybe we can pray in the same altar because we have different interpretation of God, because God is a great mystery and we cannot put an accentuation in one or another attribute of God. But it's clear that we need to act together to defend the human dignity, the freedom to each one, the peace and the justice, because also this is the essence of the gospel. And this was very important to say, and this is the project of the Pope Francis. The project of the Beatitudes is the project of this: peace, justice, dignity. And I think that it's really that we need to act together, and we agree, especially with the extreme form of indifference, that is in grand part the refugees and the new form of slaves. And they declare also that this is a crime against humanity. And this was signed by all these very important leaders. So, for the part of the religion, I think that we can count with the help. Thank you.
Very good. Pranziamo? Jeff.
I just wanted to also refer, you ended, we can help, and I wanted to refer to Cardinal John's statement, if I got it correctly said, helpless people deserve to be helped. That's a fundamental starting point. Cut through everything, and that for sure is true. And so we should take that, I think this is what they both said, and I think we should take that as the first absolute pillar beyond discussion. Helpless people deserve to be helped, and make sure that we don't make any confusion about that point.